We begin by pivoting to other places. So, for example, the African continent was maybe significantly affected by these global reorderings. We think about the slave trade. So think about all the people that were taken, but also what this does to their communities, the bringing in of guns, the violence, the trade in new goods. But we also begin to see some sort of legitimate trade. So we see an increase in trade, but we also have to think about what Africa was offering the world. Um, and so we still see things like ivory, gold, um, still being sought after. But we're also going to see a situation where Europeans will begin to suggest that they are ending slavery and they are becoming more involved in the African continent. We can debate whether they were actually helping to end the slave trade, especially after 1807, the abolition of the trade. But we actually begin to see um, new forms of trade, domestic domestic types of trade, but also trade to export goods. So there now, of course, with slave labor, there were many discussions and questions over whether people worked better if you remunerated them than if you work them to death, which was kind of so that was one model: work them to death, import more people. But also, if you begin to pay people, perhaps you're going to find less or more cooperation. Um, and so these debates were going on when we think about abolitionism in Britain, in the US. These were some of those debates. Quakers, especially in the North. But again, the slave trade was very insidious because the North, especially in the US, had more factories. And so if you were buying cotton from the South, were you not enabling slave trade? But so these are some of those discussions that were going on. But then we see actual abolition. So, for example, Denmark, Great Britain, 1807, and the US, 1808. But abolition did not mean that it's almost like, okay, we are not going to allow people to be importing people, but the people who are already here and enslaved, oops, they are. And so, again, when you think about laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act and others, so we're stopping the trade. We are not stopping actual sale and purchase of. Now, other European, again, we have to remember that slave trade was, especially the transatlantic slave trade, was primarily pushed by European countries. But again, remember, they are going to begin losing their territories the in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, for example, France loses Saint Domingue, and so almost by default, slave trade begins to diminish. Um, and so over time, we see the question of enslavement, the number of people who are enslaved diminishing, even though we say that in Brazil, slavery ends in 1888. So there were still quite a number of people who were enslaved. And so the British, for example, are very interesting because they freed people who were captured. The US and Britain maintained I forget what the squadron was called, maybe West African Squadron, and its whole job was to find slave ships and rescue those people. And so, for example, the British would take the freed people to Sierra Leone. Um, Unfortunately, then the British later colonized Sierra Leone, so it's almost like you're suffering double tragedy. Of course, the United States established not Sierra Leone, Liberia, and you can sort of begin to see why Liberty, even though it was founded by the American Colonization Society, which sounds like an anathema. So the new trade in Africa, so we see promotion of what might be considered legitimate trade. And so things like palm oil. Palm oil was used in factories to grease machinery, to make things like soaps, things like peanuts, vegetable oils, and so on. And so it's almost like there really wasn't anything that Africa could export that, like, it's not like they were manufacturing things like sugar or cotton or other things. So it was primarily agricultural goods, but we actually see this kind of trade now. So we see a decrease in slave trade, an increase in legitimate trade, because even the kings and the rulers in especially the western coast of Africa discovered that maybe their people going into slavery wasn't helping them. They couldn't defend themselves. They could not. The most productive people are being taken out. So this was hollowing out their societies, and so we actually begin to see a decrease in slavery. And so legitimate trade produced new forms of wealth. So, for example, Jaja of Opojo, we shall also look at other kings, for example, in Dahomey, and so on. We may have mentioned William Lewis, who was actually sort of, I wouldn't say invited, but he wanted to figure out a way. So he worked with the American Colonization Society, was actually funded to go back to Liberia to see if it was possible to repatriate Africans who were enslaved. So he went, I think he had a fleet of like 30 ships. And so, he goes back to Sierra Leone, he establishes himself. There were going to be challenges with, again, you have to remember that taking people back to Sierra Leone or Liberia, it's not like there were no people there. So it's almost like the reverse of Columbus coming to the New World. You're displacing people. And so some of these challenges continue in places like Sierra Leone or Liberia, where you hear terms like Americos, so people who had been enslaved. And again, remember, these were not, like, if you are returned, you aren't necessarily returned to where you came from, but they form new communities that try to industrialize and so on. So we see some perhaps new developments in some societies. So when slave trade was banned, in places like Brazil, you actually begin to see people being paid, or people who are emancipated working alongside enslaved people. So there was almost a mix of both. But again, there were elements of domestic enslavement, and as Europeans come in, they impose these forced labor. So in places like northern Nigeria, but again, if you actually look at places like Southwest Africa in 1880s, Europeans come in, and the whole idea is they are stopping the slave trade. But then they impose taxes that require people to work for Europeans. So I don't know how much freedom we can say was brought about. Now, in places like the east coast of Africa, where cloves and cotton were being grown, in places like Zanzibar, we actually see that the slave trade continues, but it wasn't the kind of slave trade that we see with the Atlantic. And so it's important to question narratives that we hear. Now, we know, for example, that more than maybe about 15 million people were brought from Africa to the Americas, north, south. But there's also this counter narrative of there were more enslaved people in Africa than there were in the Atlantic, so this wasn't really a bad thing. Um, African slavery within the African context was different. And so the notion that Africa becomes the largest slaveholding region, other accounts will say that the number of Africans who are sold to places like India and Arabia were more than the Africans who are sold to the New World. Now, these numbers, nobody was really keeping track. And sometimes the question is, are we trying to justify the transatlantic slave trade by saying, oh, this was bad, but look over there, there was also like terrible people doing slave trade. Now, again, we can't deny that there were people who were enslaved on these clove and cotton plantations in Africa, but again, you have to remember that there wasn't really significant manufacturing in the way that, for example, in the US there was. And so it's useful to sort of think about these things. Now, the ultimate outcome is that we see economic reorderings. People are beginning to buy things that are produced elsewhere. So, but again, we have to remember that most people consumed what they produced. But now we begin to see people are purchasing things, there's consumption, there's buying new things, but also states are beginning to try to limit how much stuff they import. Or so they're trying to figure out how they can make more money from the new kinds of trade. So we see changes in state policies. We should probably talk about mercantilism, where the idea is that trade should benefit the country. So, for example, you think about Britain and the British East India Company selling tea and other things to the United States. These monopolies were intended to benefit the sending country. So you see these changes, but you also see people increasingly talking about the importance of free trade, investment in commercial infrastructure. So, for example, building roads and harbors and canals and so on. But we also should talk about 1750 to 1850 being the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We shall talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution and the things that it brought us. But if you think about when the world actually becomes mechanized, from about 1794, Dennis Papin makes the first internal combustion engine. But and then we see people like James Watt, who is making the Watt steam engine. But these are like stationary engines, and initially they were built to empty mines of water. So Britain had, maybe I should say that the Industrial Revolution actually is believed to have begun in Britain. There are reasons why it begins in Britain. One of the reasons is, and again, this is where we see the connection of things in the past that affect things in the future. For example, we talked about the little or mini ice age, which goes on from about 1400 to about 1800. Now, so the mini ice age required people to find ways of staying warm. Now, you could do that by either buying clothes, but again, the clothes then were made out of wool, which did not dry quickly, especially in winter. And so cotton becomes a more useful kind of fabric. And so the question is, how do we produce more cotton so we can produce more clothes so we can stay warm? So you can actually see the Industrial Revolution as really just about staying warm. Now, of course, you can burn trees to stay warm, but after a while, trees take a bit of time to grow, and so there was need to find a new source of heating. And coal became the new source of heating. It's actually interesting that even today, a majority of the electricity in the US, maybe 30%, is produced with coal-fired power plants. So again, we are still using 17th century technologies or sources of heating. And so because Britain is an island, and coal was underground, you had to dig it. And so if you dig it, the mines would flood with water. And so how do you get the water out of the mines? You can use your physical strength. You can use buckets and just, dump the water out. But so the first engines were actually built to help empty the mines. And then other people begin to think, well, what if we actually put this engine on a carriage? What would then happen? And so the motorization of transportation begins. It's almost like these industries that feed each other. The maybe more modern equivalent would be, think about the things that the internet has spawned. So initially, people would just write emails and do other things, but now you have apps, you have, you have like ride shares, you can order food on an app. So all of this is new infrastructure that depends on the backbone of the internet. And so if we sort of think about the present and maybe then take it back to 200 years, the Industrial Revolution begins to do these kinds of things using newer technologies. And so we see more commodities being produced as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And so people are no longer producing what they use. So if you think about, for example, your own case today, I'm sure none of you go to a farm to plant stuff so you can eat. Someone does that. And there are ways you probably have a part-time job or other things or other supports. But so think about the things that you do for yourself that are related to basic needs: food, shelter, clothing. You don't build your own house, you do not make your own clothes. So all of this is a result of the Industrial Revolution. And so the Industrial Revolution reconfigures people's activities. And so most people are going to begin to move to cities where they find jobs. But also we see people being able to afford goods that were thought of as luxury. So for example, the Industrial Revolution brings about the use of rayon, which is a kind of silk. Not sure if we have talked about how silk was made, but it was actually in China, it was initially made by boiling silkworms, which sounds like a horrible thing to do. But now there are new ways of making the same products. So we see people changing their consumption. They are buying things, they are shopping, you see a lot of advertising, you see the use of European goods. And so we actually see more easily available commodities, but also the shift of power to Europe. I previously have mentioned that by 1700, about 53% of the global GDP was produced by China, which had about 30%, and India, which had about 22%. So those two countries accounted for more than half of the global GDP. But by 1850s, they accounted for about 8%. So the GDP, the production shifts to Europe. People are beginning to shop, people have money, they have time, and so they are pursuing these other pursuits, for example, sports, leisure, and so on. So this is kind of part of the 18th century, the beginning of globalized trade, but also industrialization shifts what people do, how they do it, where they do it, the amount of money that they have, the kinds of occupations that they have. So moves them from farms and the countryside to become more urbanized. And so if you actually look at the urbanization figures from about 1700 to 1800, you see a clear shift of about 50%. So people move to cities where there are more jobs. So we begin to see the rise of European manufacturers, but and so there's a lot of debates about whether European industrialization caused a decline in Asia, so India and China, because India and China were doing more of a lot of their production was cottage industry. So people worked in their houses to produce whether it was silk or cotton. But industrialization actually changes this. So, for example, to produce 100 pounds of yarn, of cotton yarn, would take someone about 5 years. 100 pounds, 5 years. But industrialization changes this so that it takes about 2 weeks to produce 100 pounds of yarn. So if you are an investor, it makes sense to use the machine because you're going to produce more than this one person is producing. And so because Europe industrializes and China does not, in India, you actually see the shift. So um, they, so for example, the British are importing cotton. Ironically, the cotton is grown in India and then exported to Britain, where it is now processed and made into yarn. It was also imported from other places. So, for example, the Sudan was a very productive region in terms of cotton, but also maybe Egypt. If you think about bedding, for example, even today, you might hear something about Egyptian cotton. So the the growing of these raw materials is done outside of Europe, and we actually see this even today. And so, but also there were other reasons. So, for example, the British established the Bank of England, which provided loans to industrialization or people who are industrializing, and so they were able to create more factories with state backing. So, but also other things, for example, protection of private property, protection of lenders, but also the state was interested because if people are producing and they are paying taxes, then the state has more money to do other things. And so, but also they are protecting the traders by imposing tariffs. So you probably have heard a lot about tariffs in the past 1 month, maybe. Yeah. So tariffs basically are, if I want to import, say, oranges from Mexico. Now, Florida grows lots of oranges. So if I find cheaper oranges than those that are in Florida, then I am going to depress the market, or I'm going to depress the sales of oranges from Florida. And so if the government imposes tariffs and says, to bring in oranges, you're going to pay 20% more, then I'm going to look at my oranges and decide if they are still going to be competitive against Florida oranges. And so tariffs are supposed to protect domestic industries and make them produce more. Not sure if that actually happens. And I use examples of, if you think about the minimum wage in the US. So for example, if you establish a factory that produces socks, say around Hampton Roads or Hampton University. Now you have to get some labor to work for in your factory. And so if you're going to pay people at least minimum wage, that is going to be about $7 per hour, $7.25. Not sure if Virginia minimum wage is higher than that. Now, so if I employ one person to make 10 pairs of socks per day, let's imagine that someone can make 10 pairs of socks a day. So, and I hire them for 8 hours. So I'm going to have paid them about $60 at the end of the day. But if I go and produce the socks in India, and I can pay someone, say, $3 for the day, then it makes sense to me to go to India and produce socks, the same number of socks, for about $3 or $4. So based on that calculation, I'm saving about $57. And so even if the government in the US says, well, you're making your socks in India, so we're going to charge you $15 per pair of socks. I'm going to add the $15 to the $3, comes to $18. It's still cheaper to produce socks there than it is here, just based on the labor. And so you hear lots about tariffs and protections, but the question is the cost of labor, the cost of materials, and so on. But what we actually then find is that we see a reliance on imported goods by practically everyone, including the lower social classes. So they are no longer making their clothes, it's like secondhand clothes and other things. And so we actually begin to see new services, new engagement. So for example, if you have a factory, you probably need someone to do the books, so you have an accountant. You probably need someone to take the orders, so you probably have a secretary or something. And so you see the creation of new jobs, lawyers, accountants, other people. You also see the emergence of new classes of people. So like the investors become the so-called bougie class. So financiers, factory owners, and so on. And so you actually see a shift in the upper classes, where before industrialization, the upper classes were like the nobility, the clergy, and so on. But now we see the bourgeoisie class, so people like Rockefeller, people like Carnegie, who are investing in these newer technologies, the Rothschilds and other people. And so, you know, the British do actually embrace industrialization quickly, and they become one of the leading powers in terms of industrialization. In fact, from about 1815, 1814-ish to about 1914, that period is often generally referred to as Pax Britannica, the era of British imposed peace. They had the biggest navy. They created one of the biggest empires. In fact, there was a saying maybe about the 1900s that the sun never set on the British Empire, because somewhere where the sun was shining was the British Empire. So if you think about India, if you think about Australia at that point, if you think about Africa, the colonization, and maybe the Americas, so the British become the leading power in the world. Now, we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution in other contexts, in terms of inventions, applications, the building, the phases of the Industrial Revolution. So the first phase, which was driven by the steam engine, the second phase that was driven by chemicals, electricity, and other things, and some people say the third phase is the technological revolution that begins about maybe 1990s, ICT, so mobile phones, those kinds of things. Now, so again, begins in Britain. It begins from coal, digging up of coal, emptying the mines. And so this is actually one of those kinds of power plants. And the power plants worked very simply, because you feed coal into a burner that creates steam, and the steam is used to drive propellers and other things. And so actually, if you think about things like steamships, that's kind of how they were driven. So coal and steam become very important, and so steam is driving the internal combustion engines. This is before people begin to use gasoline or gas. People like James Watt, a major industrialist, and so But the person who, what's his name? Stevenson, maybe, who actually creates the first motorized railway transport. But again, remember that carriages had been there. So the thing was to figure out how to put an engine into a carriage. Cotton becomes Britain's dominant industry. So most everything was based on cotton, undercuts the Indian, as I mentioned, production. And so the British Industrial Revolution actually was really bad for Indian women because that's kind of the work that they did. And so now you have these machines, and especially cotton, or rather cottage industries, because you're doing this work in your house. Now factories are beginning to be under one roof, and these are the times when there was this belief that the place of women was in the homes, not in the factories. And so if you're not really producing, if the machines are producing more than you are, then they're undercutting you. So maybe your job is kind of redundant. And so we see these new inventions shifting cotton productions from India to Britain. And this produces a new sort of global shift in economic power from India to China. Now, it's important to maybe define what the Industrial Revolution was. And so a formal definition is technological breakthrough that gave humankind a new degree of control over nature, created vast wealth, transformed the daily activities of most people, and opened up unimagined possibilities for social and cultural life. So people who worked in factories, think about, even though people worked like long hours, there were people who worked up to like 18 hours a day. But think about what they did at the end of the workday. I mean, this is the beginning of other forms of entertainment. So think about like going to the theater, plays. Of course, there were no movies by that time. TV and radio were not invented. But so these technological breakthroughs give people control over nature. So people do not depend on the sun to stay warm. And you can begin to see those changes now. So we don't depend on lighting fires to stay warm. We, um, switch the thermostat to whatever level we feel comfortable with. We do not go and produce our own food. So these new activities. In fact, if you think about the case of the US, not sure if you know how many people list their occupation as farming. Um, it's actually about 3.3%, which comes up to about 3 million people feeding this country. Now, of course, if you think about eggs, I hear there's an egg crisis right now, but but think about how many people feed a nation such as this. And so these are the kinds of uh, degrees of control over nature. So 1750, most people would have been producing their own food. 1850, people are working in factories and they are creating these new trade opportunities. And so when we really think about the Industrial Revolution, application of new energy sources, especially coal, machines, the use of machinery, the deployment of interchangeable parts. But actually the Industrial Revolution, especially these machines, was also not good for kids. And this is a time when there were no really rules against child labor. So you found 5 and 6 year olds in factories actually working for up to 10, 12 hours. Now, I don't know if you know any 5 year olds and their level of concentration, but working them in factories sounds like a really terrible thing. So this deployment of interchangeable parts, for example, if machines broke down, the kids were sent in there to take out. These machines were not very good, but again, even today we still see breakdown of technologies. Now, so Britain leads this new industrialization, this new economic order. overtakes China and India. And part of the challenges for China and India is that they did not necessarily adopt these newer technologies, even though they were maybe proprietary. So it's not like James Watt was inviting people to come and see how his engine works. But so, the British were especially invested, but there were other reasons that perhaps we shall talk about some other time. But again, we also see, for example, the Ottoman Empire doesn't change, doesn't adopt modernity, doesn't adopt industrial revolution. And so Europe kind of was primed to change. Europe was quick to change, sometimes in good ways and sometimes not in so good ways. So if you think about slavery, if you think about colonization, these are changes. Changes that are not done by other empires, for example, India and China. And so we see these kind of new ways of living, new ways of production, new ways of being. So commodities, capital, the rules, and so on. And so if you begin to think about where industrialization happens, particularly in Britain, so a lot of it begins in Britain and then spreads to parts of Europe, for example, but mostly Northern Europe. So in places like Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, northern France. But if you look at, for example, Italy and the Austrian Empire, what would become the Balkans, you don't really see a lot of industrialization, which is maybe in part driven by the disunity, for example, in Italy, but also in places like Spain, you really don't see a lot of, you do see some industrialization. But for example, if you look at where coal is in France, in northern Spain, in Britain, and so places that had coal were more likely to industrialize. But there were also other factors that led to industrialization. So, for example, in Britain, private property ownership meant, so for example, if I had a farm that is 100 acres and I don't want anyone to be living on it or farming on it, these people have to find a way of living. So a lot of private property in Britain caused people to move to urban areas to look for jobs. They were not very well paying. Now, when we think about working and living, the Industrial Revolution produces both positives and negatives. If you actually think about the conditions for living in urban areas, they were terrible, really, because, for example, there was no indoor plumbing. And so if you think about what people did with their waste, it's probably not worth thinking about. But waste was dumped in the street. And so, I mean, there's also like other waste, like horses. And so it's not like you're picking up after your horse. So, basically living in urban areas was terrible. And we can see how, for example, diseases ravage this population. So, for example, the cholera outbreaks in London. But also, if something like a fire broke out, it kind of burned people and properties and so there weren't these facilities that we often take for granted today. So roads were not necessarily built. And so again, think about urban life and work routines, living in cities, unhealthy, no running water. And so people are using the same water that is running off into the rivers. A story is told of how, for example, one of the major rivers in Britain was so polluted, the Thames, that in 1858 Parliament adjourned because the river runs next to the Houses of Parliament, and it was so polluted that the stench just kept coming up. And so, but we also then begin to see cities working to rectify this issue. So, for example, in places like Paris, France, you begin to see the building of wider roads, basically city infrastructure. Now, we also begin to see other maybe innovations. So, for example, the use of the clock. And again, think about how we use the clock even today. Most of the things that you do are governed by clocks. So, for example, when this class ends at 9:15, your clock will tell you where to go next. So, think about these routines. Now, if you live on a farm, um, in the 1700s, really the thing that governs your routine is you. Like you're working on the farm, your house is over there, so really it's not. But if you think about if you have ever had a job, or if you're going to class, you have a clock that really governs where you are. Now the wages were obviously very low, and so this is where we begin to see people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels begin to talk about socialism. The ownership of the means of production, and how this might, so like if their argument that if people own the factories, they would probably give themselves better conditions. But we actually also begin to see legislation that changes how people interact. Now we also begin to see social protests. Um, we also begin to see immigration or emigration, so people going to places where these jobs are. And so if you think about emigration, for example, from Britain to or Europe to the New World, um, from about 1800 to 1914, it is estimated that about 60 million people emigrate to the West. And so again, they are emigrating to factories, to other countries where factories are being started. But we're also beginning to see people like the factory owners working to control the sources of these raw materials. So, for example, the British try to control India. Um, so, social protest and immigration, I briefly mentioned social protest. And so, for example, the Luddites, who were jobless craftsmen um, who were breaking machines that pushed them out of work. There was an interesting protest maybe sometime last year when ports were shutting down. And part of the argument, part of the reason, or part of the negotiations was that longshoremen are being replaced by machines. And so this whole idea of mechanization wasn't necessarily supported. So again, if you think about mechanization even today, and we are probably getting to a point where machines are going to do some of the work that we do. AI is doing some of the work that we have been doing traditionally. So we begin to see technology replacing people. Now, if you lose a job because you've been replaced by technology, you might want to break that technology so that maybe you can get your job back. So you begin to see these protests, but you also begin to see even the people who have jobs in factories and mines, they are beginning to organize and saying, well, this is not a great way to spend your day. So, for example, if you are digging coal, there's a disease that's known as black lung disease. So you're inhaling the coal particles, and so eventually it affects your breathing. And black lung disease kills people really quickly. If you look it up and look up West Virginia, you'll see some of these effects. And so there are these developments, there are positive developments, people have work, but also negative developments, like why are 6-year-olds working in mines up to 12 hours a day, being punished when they fall asleep? And I mean, what 5-year-old doesn't need a nap? And so we actually then begin to see this emigration. So it's a period of great change. Now, so we do see these changes in Europe that are driven by industrialization. Now, again, you have to remember that Europe is really not that big. And so it's not like cotton is being grown in the UK. It's being grown outside of the UK and then imported. I often marvel at the idea that the British produce the best tea. Not Americans, not Lipton tea, the British. But there is no tea that grows in Britain. All of their tea is imported as raw materials and then they process it. So they are going out to try and find sources of these raw materials. And so they're using coercion, they're using sometimes they are paying people, but mostly they're using coercion. And so if you look at a place like India, it's huge if you can control it. And since they already grow cotton, then you can actually get all of that cotton and do. And so you see this relationship between merchants and the ruling elite. And we actually begin to see this. So, for example, we mentioned that Hernan Cortez was made a governor of something or something else. Columbus was made a governor. So he's a trader, a merchant, but he is ingratiated with the political class. Now, so when these developments occur, we also see European or other Asian and African and other populations trying to catch up. So, for example, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. So, one of the modern founders of Russia, Peter the Great, actually goes to Europe for about 18 months to try and learn what Europeans are doing with industrialization, with mechanization, so that he can take some of that knowledge back to Russia, even though it really did not really significantly help Russia. And part of that is because Russia was so huge. So, but again, China remained strong, and so it wasn't until maybe like almost 1900. Well, let me take that back. China remained strong as an empire. Remember, this is the Qing Empire, 1648 to 1911. And so its height of power was in the 1790s. So while Europe is industrializing, China is at the height of its power. But, and I may have mentioned this, Europeans are still trying to find something the Chinese want. And so they actually begin smuggling opium into China, which is a terrible thing to do. And so China is still maybe trying to keep out Western influences. But again, Western powers are growing more powerful. They are having more better weapons. They now have steamships. And part of their whole existence is to try and take over China's predominance in trade. And so, for example, we see an opium war in 1839 to 1842, the first opium war. There's a second opium war in 1856. And so all of these are attempts by Western powers to kind of take control over China. Now, so let's see what else was going on in other places. So Russia, as I mentioned, Peter the Great founds the Russian Empire in 1721. There are a few rulers in between, a few Catherines, a few Peters, a few Pauls. Catherine the Great is best known, and so again, she's in power during this beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So she rules from about 1750s to about 1795. And so Catherine the Great was actually Austrian. So she kind of knew about Enlightenment, was keeping up with the trends in Europe, industrialization and so on. And so, she leaves the monarchy. She actually steps down, dies soon after, and she leaves the monarchy to her son, Paul, I think the third, who dies within like 4 years, and then Alexander the First takes over. And so again, Alexander the First, if you remember the Napoleonic Wars, Alexander the First is in power. And so Alexander the First was a little more, he was about modernization, but not too much. Now, When he dies, there's a crisis in Russia because it's sort of like, well, can we have maybe like the French Revolution or other revolutions? And Tsar Nicholas the First is like, no, we are not going to do that. He does some other things that are really terrible. For example, he institutes secret police. He calls himself the defender of the Christian faith. And so, actually, interestingly, he goes to war with France over who is the person who is the protector of Christians. Very strange. So, secret police, censorship, yeah, maintain serfdom. Have we talked about serfdom? Serfdom was like slavery in Russia. People were confined to the so if you think about people who owned land, like these huge landowners who would have servants. So serfdom was like servanthood, but serfs could be sold the same way as slaves were sold. And so he maintains this, but his successor, Alexander II, actually changes, and he's actually going to free the serfs. But so again, sort of think about how some places are adapting to modernity, other places are like, we like what we have, like China and Russia, and so we are not changing. Now, in other areas, so for example, the Ottoman Empire begins to be taken apart slowly by slowly. For example, in 1832, Greece becomes independent. Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, becomes independent. Actually with the support of the British. In 1830, the French take over Algeria. Algeria was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the way they take over Algeria is very interesting because the representative of the Ottoman Sultan slaps a French diplomat. And so the French are like, you slapped our person, now we have to fight you. So they fight the Ottoman Empire and take over Algeria. So the Ottoman Empire begins to be taken apart. Muhammad Ali is considered probably the modern founder of Egypt. He actually takes Egypt out of the realm of the Ottoman Empire, even though he was actually Turkish. And so you begin to see these changes, these dismemberments, these movements, these reforms. So, for example, Egypt begins to sort of look to other countries rather than the Ottoman Empire, like how can we change and adapt to modernity? Now, his son was the one who actually allowed the building of the Suez Canal, which facilitated easy transport, so you didn't have to go around Africa. He makes some reforms in education and agriculture, but so part of the consideration is how can you bring these empires into the modern era? Now, the Ottoman Empire itself begins to modernize, to do some reforms, so they institute some freedoms. We shall talk about this in a different context. So they had some what they call reorganizations called tanzimats, and so each sultan was coming in and trying to figure out, one, how do we collect more taxes? Two, how do we keep the empire together? Because again, you see, it's beginning to be dismembered. But again, there were still those who said, well, why are we reforming anything? We should stay the way we are. And so, for example, one of those tanzimats or edicts suggested that people should be treated equally in the Ottoman Empire, whether they were Muslim or Christian. And so, you begin to see these changes, those kinds of innovations that even bring in European advisors, military advisors, and so on. But actually, the Ottoman reforms didn't go far enough. So they didn't adopt industrialization and so on. They do change some, so instead of organized, so if you look to Japan and China, you don't see a lot of changes. In the Ottoman Empire, you see quite a bit of changes. And each new ruler would come in and then change some things, kind of like Russia a little. And so people who are collecting money were keeping some of the money, and so that wasn't helping the Sultan. In other places like India, the British take over. So again, think about industrialization and its impacts. And so, in fact, India was known as the jewel. Well, maybe that was Singapore in the British crown. But India was very important, profitable. But actually, from about 1750 to 1858, it was technically controlled by the British East India Company. And so there was a war in 1857, and the British did some terrible things, the first war of Indian independence. And so after that, the British Empire takes over. And so part of what, for example, the company was doing now, maybe there was need for some changes. So for example, in India, there was a tradition known as sati. And so sati was, if a husband died, you probably know that a lot of Hindus are cremated. So if a husband died, the wife was cremated with the husband, even though she wasn't dead, which sounds like not a good thing. And so these are some of the things that the British are trying to stop. So, you know, they're establishing political control, but they're also trying to change some of these traditions, some of these practices. I think that was probably worth changing. But again, if you sort of think about the ongoing or the gradual control of India by the British, you see that some places they controlled, other places they kind of allied themselves with local princes, and they had very interesting ways of controlling the territory. So, for example, they recruited Indian soldiers, which actually was part of the reason for the first Indian War of Independence. But so India is a very class-based society. There are like 5 different classes. The Brahmins, the priests, are the top. The Dalits, or the untouchables, are the bottom. And so they would take the untouchables and make them soldiers over the Brahmins. And so it's sort of like you really took the untouchables and made them rule over us. And so the British then create a conflict, a class conflict in India. And so the class conflict is so much that you're not focusing on the British, you're focusing on the Brahmins are being ruled by the Dalits. Not going to happen. Or they would take Muslims and make them rule over Hindus. So, but again, this is the British expansion. There were some really negative effects, even though, yeah, the company, the British East India Company, kind of replaces the Mughal Empire. Remember, India was controlled by the Mughal Empire. But also, as we mentioned, the industrial sector in India continues to. So, reforms, for example, an end to sati, English to replace Persian. And so, for example, you probably hear this often that most call centers are based out of other places rather than here. But again, the British East India Company does some shady things that leads to the British Crown taking over, particularly after the Indian War of Independence. But the British colonial powers actually, when they decided to make themselves princes, they took local wives, they called themselves nabobs. Yeah. So on Thursday, we shall look briefly at the Qing Empire, and then think about nations and empires in the after the 1850s period, to see how they change. So we shall stop there for today.